I'm here just to kind of stimulate some thinking around some questions that are very close to my heart, and that I hope will be of some meaning and significance to you too. What I want to do in the next 30 minutes is just give you an overview of the four questions that I want to kind of focus on. And the first one is, who am I? The audacity to speak about something like spiritual transformation. I thought it might be helpful to say a little bit more about myself so you know where I'm coming from on this. The second question that I want to hold with you and kind of carry a little bit is the core question: what is spiritual transformation? So we're going to look at the question of what do we mean when we're talking about the Spirit, and what do we mean when we're talking about transformation? Because those are becoming increasingly important words, not just in the church, but in business and management and education, and a lot of fields are the buzzword now is transformation. And my experience is very few of us know what we're talking about when we use that word. So I've been spending years trying to clarify that, give you the fruits of some of the fruits of my labor. Third question is, what is Christian spiritual transformation? What's distinct about Catholic Christian spiritual formation, spiritual transformation? What makes our experience of that a little different? And finally, my favorite question, which I always end my classes with at the university and seminary, is so what? I mean, what significance is this? What difference does this make to us practically in our daily lives? And the way I want to spin that question is what can we take home? How do we actually experience what we're talking about? Because I think the core word that I want to kind of keep coming back to is the word experience. And just to say, I remember talking to my pastor at Our Lady Queen of the World. It was the end of Easter celebrations a couple of years ago. And I said to him, gee, Father Michaud, you must be so happy, like all the work you've done with these liturgical celebrations, and what a great feeling of satisfaction, to have gone through the Triduum and Lent and Holy Week. And he said, actually, it's one of the most depressing times of the year for me, Easter. He was a very honest guy. And I said, well, tell me, why would Easter be so depressing, and especially after Easter, a season of joy and celebration? He said, because I come back after my few days of rest, and I notice that nobody's been transformed. Nobody's really very joyful. Nobody's very happy. You don't really sense that people have actually had a profound experience of what we're celebrating at Easter, the death and the resurrection of Christ in our lives. We've gone through the liturgical rites and the celebration and so on, but I don't have the feeling that when I look out at the people's faces, I don't have the feeling that people have really interiorized this or taken this into their lives. And so I feel like, why are we here? What are we doing here? And I thought, geez, that's a pretty good question. And it brings me back to I often say this to the parents when we're doing sacramental prep in our parish. If we're not doing transformation, if all we're doing is information or even formation, which are good things, if as Catholics we believe that, church is about informed faith and maybe formed in virtues and values, then we may as well shut the door. Because the truth is that the church is about transformation. It's about experiencing the power of God's unconditional love and living out of that in a very new way, in a way with new consciousness and new faith and new love. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And the first thing I want to tell you about myself in my work, I had lunch today with my neighbor. And my neighbor fixes laser printers for a living. And so he's not a guy who thinks a lot about theology and spirituality. He says, I've been watching you for the last few years and trying to figure out what you do. And, because I notice you travel a lot. And so we were sitting at Wendy's today, and I said, now, how am I going to explain to Mark what I do? And it's a little bit like the story with Father Michel. I said, well, Mark, you see all these churches on the street corners here? The Protestant, the Catholic, the Orthodox churches. I said, a lot of these churches are dying. The mainline Protestant churches are in a free fall. I mean, we know this empirically. The Catholic churches, if it wasn't for immigration in North America, the Catholic churches would be in a free fall too. As it is, declining attendance is a huge issue, and a lot of churches will come to people like me. I have a background in spiritual theology and practical theology, and they'll say, "What do we do to bring young people, youth and young adults, back into our churches? Because we're dying. We're not able to pay the bills anymore. We're clustering parishes. We're closing churches. They're turning into nightclubs and community centers, and we don't know what to do." And I say, well, have you ever heard of the word spirituality? Because almost anybody under the age of 40 now, many people under the age of 40 at least, are saying, I'm spiritual but not religious. Does that sound familiar to you? Okay. Most of the Gen X and Gen Y and the millennials don't get the religion thing quite the same way as the boomers and the older ones. And so if you don't understand spirituality, you don't understand how to transform people, and you don't understand the meaning of spiritual practice, you're in trouble. So I help churches figure that out. I help seminaries figure that out. I teach courses in practical spirituality, applied spirituality in seminaries. And I lead a lot of retreats around this with pastors and ministers, priests as well, because there's a paradigm shift going on in our culture. And spirituality now, I think, is number 2 behind cookbooks in terms of mass trade publication. Spirituality is huge. It's a tsunami culturally. But the last place that's really catching on is the church. Business, education, medical, the medical fields, the allied health disciplines are all talking about spirituality. The church is still trying to figure out what we're talking about. So that's my passion, and it's always been my passion to understand not just how it works, but how we grow and develop spiritually. How we, to use the old language of conversion and repentance and development. What really is happening when we're talking about that? So that's a little bit about me, and then I kind of lived this journey in the communities of L'Arche as an assistant caring for people with disabilities. No, I never met Henry Nouwen personally. Maybe some people in the room here did. I would say, though, Jean Vanier has been a huge influence on my life personally and vocationally. So a lot of what I'm going to say tonight has been deeply informed and inspired by Henry and Jean, and other people like Merton and Mother Teresa, and people who are embodiments of spirituality and spiritual transformation. So that's the practical side, the experiential side. The other side is the academic and the studies in faith development and conversion and healing have been a real passion for me. So back in the 90s, when the S word wasn't being used in the academy, I had to sort of strong-arm a few professors to let me study spirituality, and I actually finished a doctorate in that, which is kind of a miracle, but they let me finish a doctorate in spirituality in a mainstream university. So that's where I'm coming from academically. Now, the next question I want to pursue with you, just very briefly, is the word spirit. And again, I'm just throwing out some ideas here to get your own thinking going here. Spirit we use all the time. And we watched the Super Bowl last night. You see spirit of a kind, a certain level of team spirit. And I would say Super Bowl is sort of the largest liturgy in North America. You're looking at sort of North American liturgy at its finest there. And there's a kind of a spirit operating. But when we're talking about spirit in a religious way or in a transcendental way, it gets very important. Again, even in chaplaincy and ministry, I'll ask people, what do you mean by spirit? Or what are the spiritual needs that we're addressing? People have a hard time articulating that. When we're talking about spiritual needs at a human level, what are we talking about? And, you could talk about reason, you could talk about imagination. I was listening to David Suzuki yesterday on on ideas or tapestry. They were interviewing him, and they were talking about, what is his vision of what inspires him, what inspires his soul, and what song inspires him. And he chose Imagine, John Lennon's Imagine. And he said, the human being is unique in their capacity to imagine a better future. That's the unique capacity of the human spirit. Well, that's one capacity, to imagine a better future, to vision. But I want to submit to you that I think we can talk about, if you look at religion and spirituality across the 10 millennia that we've lived as a species, there are 3 words that I think define the core spiritual needs of every human being. And if those needs are not being met, people will leave and go elsewhere to find them met. Okay? The first one is the need for belonging. And that's part of the reason why we're here tonight. We need to gather socially. We're social creatures. We need to connect. We need to huddle. Whether it was around a fire in prehistoric times, or whether it's around a $5 martini, whatever it is, we need to gather. And we need to move out of solitude and loneliness into human community. And the need to belong is profound, and it's a serious crisis in our society now, particularly in North America. But it's a profoundly spiritual need. It's a need to connect to other human beings. And it's also an ultimate need in the sense that our spirit needs to connect in some ultimate way, in a belonging sense, to a source, or an infinite source of ultimate reality, in a sense. That there's some sense in which we all need to connect to the larger whole of which we are a part. We need to imagine and live a connection to that, whether it's religious or not, or ideological, or political, or philosophical. We have to somehow find a way of connecting to the rest of reality, and a sense of belonging in the middle of that. The second need I would submit, and again I just throw these out for your reflection, is the need for wholeness. And when you're looking at spiritual needs, again, generally, and you listen deeper as a spiritual director, as a counselor, people generally are looking for healing in their lives. They're dealing, the Buddhists have a very good take on this, the fundamental law of suffering. The first of the Four Noble Truths is that we suffer. And we're in a condition in which, in our tradition, we would say we're separated. We're living in a state of sin in which we are somehow separated from the power that gives birth to us, and in that separation we suffer deeply. And our lives and our persons are broken at some level because of that suffering and that separation. So the need of the human spirit for healing and wholeness, I can talk about in many ways. I talk about it in Merton's sense a lot as the movement from the false self to the true self. From the false self grounded in fear to this true self grounded in love. However you want to articulate that, it is a foundational spiritual need. The third one is the need for meaning and purpose. And again, when you listen to your own heart, you listen deeply to the hearts of others, there's something about the human spirit that desires, there's an existential desire for meaning and for some sense of purpose. And not just any purpose, but a purpose that gives meaning and value to my life, that validates my life. My life has some value and some significance in the cosmic scheme of things. If I don't have some sense of transcendental meaning or purpose, then I suffer again from a sense of, well, why am I here and what am I doing here? And so again, the spiritual traditions, the wisdom traditions of mankind, humankind, have all been, in a sense, have evolved to help us with these 3 core spiritual needs. We could name a lot of other ones, but the need for belonging, the need for healing, and the need for meaning and purpose are profound core needs of the spirit, the human spirit. And then, of course, there's this is where we get a little theological. There's the Holy Spirit, which, by saying that, we acknowledge that somehow there is within us this desire, as St. Augustine said so beautifully, our hearts are restless. Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. There's an acknowledgement that our hearts are infinite. They're longing for an unconditional love. And we need to find some connection to a higher power, to use 12-step language. Higher power, a transcendental power. And if we don't, again, we suffer, we languish, we wither spiritually. And that may be part of the problem at our church. We have a very vibrant church, but I think what Father Michel is pointing to is, the question or the challenge of how do we help people meet their real spiritual needs? Not just the need to go to Mass on a weekly basis, but to live it the other 6 days of the week. So that's the word spirit and spiritual, which is a cognate of the word spirit. And then there's the word transformation. And that's kind of the second problem, or second question. And I would just say very briefly, when we're talking about transformation, obviously the word itself, trans meaning across or change, and formation, it's a change in form, it's a change in structure. That's what we're talking about etymologically. And I want to point out that we're not just talking about information. And this is a peculiar pathology in our Catholic tradition, is we somehow shrink Catholic faith down to a good informed set of beliefs. You know how we do that? Sort of like being a Catholic means believing these things and knowing what they mean. And so we want to get people informed. Or being a Catholic means having a certain set of virtues and values. This is a big one in the school system, I hear a lot. I work a lot now in the schools, and it's like the big burning issue is how do we inculcate virtues and values in students? Because now the public school is doing it too. And how do we differentiate from the public school? Are anybody teachers here? You have a few teachers? Does that resonate? Yeah, okay. So it's a big deal now because the public school is doing the same thing. So what makes us distinct? Well, I would say that what makes us distinct is, and you'll never hear this in a public school, is that we're about spiritual transformation. It's not information and just information and formation. It's like it's about bringing about the new creation, the new human, the fully human person in the image and likeness of God in Christ. And you're not going to see that in a public school. So we're going back to a core issue, and if you look in Mark's Gospel, which is the oldest of the Gospels, the first word that Jesus utters in the Gospel is the word repent, which means change. Metanoia, the Greek word, turn around, change your life. That's the first word in the oldest Gospel. Do a 180, change. What does he mean? Metanoia. Change of heart, change of mind. And Paul, I'm so grateful that we drew from Paul tonight, Romans 12. Do not be conformed, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind so that you might discern what is of God. These are the core issues of the Gospels and the letters of Paul and the pastoral letters. And yet we somehow suffer in our church from a sort of a spiritual amnesia. It's Dallas Willard is a great author. He's an evangelical, but he writes on spiritual formation. He wrote a book called The Great Omission. He said Jesus actually commissioned his disciples to go forth and make disciples of all nations. And we made them churchgoers. We kind of just omitted the disciple part. As if the disciple part was kind of a little bit weird. So let's just kind of boil it down to mass attendance or going to church on Sunday and Sunday school maybe. What I want to suggest again, and again I'm just throwing these words out kind of as teasers. If you want to read the book, and there's a whole chapter on this, but transformation from I would say from a more technical sense or point of view is what I would call a shift in consciousness. It's a shift in consciousness, identity, and behavior. If you don't have a shift in those three things, you're not fully transformed. And I invite pastors and priests and church leaders all the time to say, what is your image of this shift in consciousness? What is it you're trying to bring about? This shift in consciousness, in this shift in identity, and this shift in behavior, that's informed and inspired by the Gospels. Because if you don't have an image of that, nothing's going to happen. If you don't have a vision of what transformation is about, it's just going to be, like I always say, it's going to be a Tim Hortons drive-through. That's how it feels sometimes at church. It's like people go in and they receive the sacrament and they're out of there. It's like the Daytona 500, in the parking lot. Get out of there as soon as you can before everybody else gets to the parking lot and you're stuck in traffic. It's a debasement of what we're there for. So I want to show you a little trailer of a new movie that's coming up. And I just ran across this a few days ago, and I thought, oh, this is good. Because it's an image of transformation, and it's right out of the heart of the culture, right out of the belly of the beast. And it's called Limitless. It hasn't been released yet. It comes out March 18th. I don't know if anybody's heard of this movie. Has anybody heard of this movie? Okay. So this is an image of transformation. And I want you to pay attention to the title, first of all, Limitless. Very interesting theology right there. Limitless. So when you think of the creaturely status of the human person in our biblical tradition, the title itself is very pregnant with meaning. But it's the story of a guy who, you'll see, who is sort of a struggling writer who somehow receives the gift of medication, and that transforms him and gives him, you know how they say, we only function with 15% or 20% of our brain capacity, gives him 100% capacity. 100% brain capacity. And so you see an image of the transformation very briefly here. So I'm going to just put this out here for you, and I'm going to highlight the central question that comes up in the trailer, the question that's raised by the narrator. How many of us know what it's like to become the perfect version of ourselves? That's the question. It comes up. How many of us know what it's like to become the perfect version of ourselves? Can we have the trailer? Right here.
See that guy? That's me. My excuse for looking like this? I'm a writer.
Eddie, maybe it's time to let the writing go.
But just in case you think nothing ever happened to me.
Eddie Mora!
Hey, tell me about this book. Why must you be written about? One more. Well, I suppose I can help you with that. You know how they say that we can only access 20% of our brain? This lets you access all of it. They've had clinical trials and it's FDA approved. I just out of curiosity, and that's all. I was blind, but now I see. A tablet a day, and I was limitless. I now had cultural appetites.
Since when do you speak Italian?
I finished my book in 4 days. I like to renegotiate my advance. Math became useful.
12,000 and 2.3 million in 10 days. I'm baffled by this guy. So, Eddie Mora, you do know you're a freak. What's your secret?
Medication.
Your powers are a gift from God or whoever the hell wrote your life script. I'll open up a line of credit for you. You'll be wanting a few toys.
How many of us ever know what it is to become the perfect version of ourselves? What's the asking price?
12.5.
I'll take it. Everything I have, I want to share with you.
What you doing, hon? You think somebody's watching?
My brain is skipping time. I have no memory of the last 4 days.
Your powers are not earned. You're careless with those powers. You ask yourself what you're going to do when you run out? You'll die. no scenario in which you lead this life where you don't work for me. No scenario. I see every scenario. I see 50 scenarios. That's what it does, Carl. It puts me 50 moves ahead of you. Worth the risk. What would you do?
I think you get the gist of it, though. This is the image of the perfect version of this guy. And the first question that came to mind when I watched this was, what are the fruits of transformation? What are the fruits of authentic transformation? You got 100% of your mind. Well, you've got power. You've got fortune, fame, wealth. You've got Learjets and beautiful women, and I mean, it's just perfect in a way to illustrate the notion of what 100% potential, human potential, looks like in the world. And I got to thinking, well, what are the fruits of authentic Christian transformation? And what do we really hold up in the Christian tradition as the authentic fruits? I thought, well, gee, how convenient. This last weekend we celebrated the Beatitudes. And instead of limitless, you have blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the humble. Blessed are the ones who mourn. Blessed are they who struggle for justice. Blessed are the meek and the lowly, the gentle. And I thought it was remarkable. I can't wait for this movie because you can do a whole exegesis and a deconstruction on this movie. But the idea, of taking a pill once a day that gives you 100% access to 100% of your mind. I thought, well, wouldn't that be amazing if you could take a pill once a day and you had 100% access to your heart? You could make the journey from the mind to the heart, and you had 100% access to your heart, like Jesus did. Thinking, well, what would that pill look like? And then I thought, gee, I'm a Catholic. What would it be? It's the Eucharist. It's like, yeah, of course. I mean, we have the sacramental tradition. We've got the Word. We've got access to the spiritual life. We have ways of opening the human heart to 100%, let's say, not 100%, but let's say a much greater percent of its potential. And the fruits of that, as Jesus said, are the Beatitudes. As Paul says, it's the fruits of the Spirit. It's patience and love and kindness and long-suffering. It's a whole different picture. I mean, if I had a little trailer on Jean Vanier or Henry Nouwen or Mother Teresa, Saint Mother Teresa, say, this is what it looks like for us. And yet when we look at our lives, again, I mean, how many of us, and how much of us is chasing after that, and how much of us is really seeking to be transformed in the way that I'm talking about, and how much support does the church give to us in this process of spiritual transformation? So the last thing I really want to say about transformation is that in the book and the study of large communities over the last 20, 30 years, now it's been 30 years, I would sum it up in one word. And some of you who've heard me speak before know what that word is. I'm taking this from Henry Nouwen, I'm taking it from Jean Vanier, and taking it from others. It's coming to know oneself as the beloved of God. If I had to sum it up in one word, it would be the attaining of Christ consciousness. The consciousness of Christ himself, which we hear in the baptism of Jesus, when Jesus comes to know himself as the Christ of God, is given in a voice from heaven saying to him, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And the archetype of the baptism in the Gospels is also the one that guides our baptism in the church, which is a death and a resurrection to a new life in Christ, a new consciousness, a new identity, and a new life, a new set of behaviors. And that is coming to know oneself, find one's meaning and healing and belonging in this new consciousness, this Christ consciousness. Other traditions will have Buddha consciousness and Krishna consciousness and the Tawhid and Sufism and Islam. Every tradition has some definition of what the ultimate state of consciousness is. For us, I would say Christ consciousness is this experience of knowing oneself as fundamentally and unconditionally loved. And living out of that awareness and awakening that in others. So the whole aim of spiritual transformation and spiritual formation is to help awaken this in the people that we're given to care for and in ourselves. And I just rolled over a whole vast continent of things that we could say about how that happens and what that means. But the last thing I want to say before we get to discussion is the so what question. So that sounds wonderful. That sounds so delicious. That sounds so yummy. It's like those chicken wings. It sounds great. How do you get there? And that's where we fall down flat. And not just the Catholic Church, but I have to say, I was telling the parents of the confirmation kids, and I get a little hot under the collar when I work with groups now, especially confirmation. Some of us, it's kind of gallows humor, but we say, it's not the sacrament of confirmation, it's the sacrament of termination. Because so many kids just disappear after their confirmation. We don't see them again until they come back to get married or baptize their own kids. We don't have anything in the church, hardly anything, for adult spiritual formation. So the church is not really helping us. And we have a lot of work to do. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just saying that's part of our deal, our DNA. We've never been very good at this. And I want to lift up three things that you can do at home. And they come right out of the research I've done in the writing of the book, and also my work in youth ministry and spirituality and congregational renewal and adult spiritual formation. And it comes back to those three core spiritual needs. The practice of belonging. It means the practice of community. That nobody grows spiritually unless they're part of a community, whether that's marriage or a partnership or a family, but fundamentally a spiritual community. If we're not part of a spiritual community, we're roadkill out there. I hate to say it, but when you're dealing with that as the paradigm, and you're living and moving and having your being in that, and you're not grounded in a spiritual community, you don't belong, and you're not reminded of who you are, then you're subject to temptations that are beyond most human beings' capacity to withstand. The second thing is the practice of healing, and I would say again. The core elements of spiritual formation have to include some kind of, like he said, what's the secret? De Niro asks him, what's the secret? And he says medication, and I'm saying it's meditation. It's spiritual practice. And again, I use that word with priests and pastors and people in schools. It's like, what are you talking about? Spiritual practice. That's what Buddhists do. That's what Hindus do. That's what Taoists do. I say that's right, and that's why so many people are going to become Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and Taoists, because they get it, that there has to be some kind of a spiritual practice. Otherwise, we're just whistling Dixie. Does that make sense? Okay? If there isn't some commitment, Thich Nhat Hanh, he wrote an amazing book called Living Buddha, Living Christ, and he said, I'm trying to figure out these church things you guys have. These things that you call churches. He says, I notice that people go and they attend these services, but nobody has a spiritual practice, it seems. He said, so I would recommend that if your church doesn't have a spiritual practice, if it doesn't teach one, I love this. He says, then you should leave and go and find a church that does teach you a spiritual practice. Because the church should really be the fellowship of practitioners, people who are, it's a spiritual community, people who are practitioners. And then, of course, he goes one step further as a Buddhist. He says, and if you can't find a church or a community that teaches you a spiritual practice, then start one of your own. And of course, we can't really go there as Catholics, but the essence of what he's saying is find a spiritual practice that heals the split between the mind and the heart, that opens your heart to, let's say, 50% of your capacity. And the third thing is the whole issue of meaning and purpose. And I would talk in those terms about finding somebody who accompanies, somebody, spiritual direction in our tradition is what we call it. Accompaniment, discernment, what Paul says, be transformed so that you might know what is of God and what isn't. Every tradition has some notion of the elder, the teacher. And people are flocking out of churches and going to traditions that like the Dalai Lama can fill Rogers Place and BC Place, no problem. Well, of course, our holy fathers can too, but people are looking for spiritual eldership and counsel, and that's a fundamental part of finding meaning and purpose in our lives. So there are ways of talking about these things in practical terms too. What I want to do, though, is I just want to end by saying that this is not a hopeless situation. I think that this room, what I'm seeing in this room, and I see more and more, is people really saying we need a new way of being church, and we need a new way of being spiritual in church, and we need to recover the original New Testament understanding of the people who followed Jesus, and they were called the people of the way. It was a way of life. It was a way of being, a way of seeing.